Eleanor Hayes had spent most of her 64 years living in a quiet town outside Portland, Maine, where the mornings came early, the evenings came slow, and life moved in a way that made people forget they were aging until the mirror reminded them. She woke every day at 6, brewed the same vanilla-scented coffee she had liked since her 40s, and sat by the window watching the tops of the pine trees sway like they had something urgent to say, something she could never quite hear. Her home was neat, warm, and filled with objects that each held a story, though many of those stories had faded so deeply that she could no longer recall them. Her life looked peaceful from the outside, but inside she felt a quiet ache she never spoke about, a soft pressure in her chest that came whenever she looked at old photographs or walked past the ocean alone, a feeling she pushed away by telling herself she had done her best, and that this was simply how life went for people her age. But there were moments, especially at sunset, when the world turned gold and pink, when she wondered if she had lived too carefully, if she had chosen safety so many times that she had forgotten how to choose anything else. It wasn't regret, not fully, but it was something close. She kept this feeling buried because admitting it would mean facing a truth that scared her, that she wanted more, even now, even at 64. The moment that changed everything for her came on a cold autumn morning. The kind where the sun rises late, and the air looks like it holds its breath. Eleanor had been cleaning her attic, not because she had planned to but because the sudden chill in the air had reminded her of the coming winter, and the thought of spending another season surrounded by old, dusty boxes felt heavier than usual. The attic held decades of her life. Holiday decorations, notebooks, photographs, and things she once promised to sort through but never did. She moved slowly through the narrow space, pushing aside boxes until her eye caught something she didn't recognize. A small cedar box with a carved pattern across the top. The wood had darkened with time, and a thin layer of dust coated it as if it had been hiding there for years. She didn't remember buying it or receiving it, and for a moment she stared at it with a strange nervousness, as if opening it would shake something loose inside her. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen, set it on the table, and hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from a sense of pressure she could not explain. When she finally opened the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Inside the box was a single letter, folded carefully, the edges yellowed with time. The envelope had her name written across it, Eleanor Hayes, in handwriting she knew instantly even after 30 years. It was Thomas Reed's handwriting. Seeing his name again after so long was like being struck by warm lightning, like hearing a song she had tried to forget but never truly did. Thomas had been the great almost of her life, the man she loved deeply in her 30s, the one she imagined building a life with, the one she thought she might grow old beside. They met when she was 32 and he was 34, both young enough to dream but old enough to know dreams could get crushed by real life. He was a writer back then, not famous but passionate, always scribbling ideas on napkins, envelopes, receipts. He loved stories, and sometimes she thought he loved the world in a way she never quite understood. But their relationship ended not in anger but in silence. One day he left for what was supposed to be a short trip to Canada to take care of family, and then the letters stopped, the calls stopped, and she was left with nothing but the belief that he had chosen something, or someone else. She told herself that heartbreak like that was a sign she had expected too much from life, so she stopped expecting. She married later, divorced quietly, worked steadily, and built a life that was tidy, calm, and safe. She never spoke Thomas's name out loud again. But now here it was, his handwriting, his presence breaking through the decades she spent trying to bury him. Eleanor's hand shook so badly she had to set the letter down for a moment. She felt heat rise up her chest, a mix of fear, longing, and the sharp sting of old wounds reopening. After several minutes she finally slid her thumb under the seal and opened the letter. The paper was brittle, but the ink, blue slightly faded, was still readable. Thomas had written the letter 30 years ago. The date hit her like a blow. This letter should have reached her when she was 34, when she still believed life could change overnight. She realized someone must have hidden it from her, intentionally or by accident. She didn't know which thought was worse. The letter began with Thomas's familiar warmth, the way he used to speak when he wanted to make her laugh. But quickly the tone changed, becoming desperate, urgent. He wrote that he never wanted to leave her. He wrote that the trip he took to Canada was supposed to be temporary, and he had planned to return within weeks. But something unexpected had happened. A family crisis, something serious. something he thought he could fix quickly but couldn't. He didn't explain the details in the letter, but he wrote that he had been caught in a situation where he felt torn between what he wanted and what he believed he owed. And what he wanted, he wrote clearly, was her. He wrote that he had made a decision. He had chosen her. He was coming back to her. He had planned to drive straight to her doorstep the week he wrote the letter. He asked her to wait for him, promising he would explain everything when he returned. He wrote about her smile, her gentleness, the way she listened when he talked about stories and dreams, and he wrote that he had never loved anyone the way he loved her. At the end, he begged her not to give up on him. Eleanor pressed her hand over her mouth, shaking. She had spent 30 years believing he walked away. 30 years believing her heart had been foolish, believing she wasn't enough for someone like him. And now she knew he had chosen her, that he had tried to come back, that he had not abandoned her at all. She tried to understand how the letter had gone missing, how it ended up in a cedar box in her attic. The thought that someone she trusted, maybe a family member, maybe her ex-husband, might have hidden it from her made her chest tighten. Or perhaps it had been misplaced during a move and forgotten. She would never know, and the not knowing cut deeply. But the deepest cut came when her mind whispered the question she did not want to hear. What happened to him after he wrote this? Why hadn't he come? Why had she never heard from him again? If he had meant what he wrote, and she believed he had, then something must have stopped him. Something real. Something serious. She read the letter again, absorbing every line, letting his words sink into the places of her heart she had locked away for decades. She felt alive and broken at the same time, like her soul had been shaken awake after years of sleep. She walked through her house in a daze, the letter gripped tightly in her hand. Every room suddenly felt different, as if she were seeing her own life from far away. As if she were a visitor in the life she built after losing Thomas. She realized she had allowed her days to become quiet because she believed she had no other choice. Now she knew her life could have been different. She could have been loved deeply, fiercely. She could have had a life filled with passion, adventure, shared dreams. The thought made her knees weak. She stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the pine trees swaying in the wind, and for the first time she felt angry. Not at Thomas, but at life, at time, at fate, at whoever or whatever had taken that letter from her. She felt angry at herself too, for not fighting harder for answers back then. But beneath the anger was something even more powerful. A hunger to know. The truth. A need. She had lived too many years not knowing. She had lived too much of her life believing a story that wasn't real. Now she needed answers. She needed closure. And somewhere deep inside her, a small flame of hope flickered, fragile but alive. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered a promise to herself. She would not let this be the end of the story. Not after 30 years of silence. Not after discovering what she could have had. Something inside her had awakened. Something brave, something fierce, something young. She didn't know what she would find, or if she would be strong enough to face it, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done living quietly. She was done accepting half-truths and half-lives. For the first time in decades, she felt the sharp, thrilling ache of possibility. And it terrified her. And it electrified her. And it changed everything. Eleanor barely slept after reading Thomas's letter, because the words kept circling in her mind like they had been waiting 30 years to be seen. And now that they were free, they refused to get quiet. So when morning came she felt both exhausted and strangely alive, as if her body had been shaken awake after decades of moving on autopilot. She spent hours walking around her house trying to make sense of everything, but every answer she tried to form only brought more questions, and one question burned hotter than the rest. If Thomas had chosen her, why hadn't he come back, and what had happened to him after he wrote the letter? The uncertainty pulled at her until she could no longer sit still, and with a sharp, steady breath she made a decision she never imagined she would make at 64. She would find out the truth herself. She packed a small suitcase, choosing clothes quickly and without thinking too long, because if she paused she knew fear would try to talk her out of it. Her movements felt strange, almost surreal, like she was watching someone else. A younger version of herself. Rushing to chase something important. Before leaving, she held the letter again, pressing her thumb over his handwriting, the curves and loops she once knew so well, and for a brief moment she felt her 34-year-old heart beating inside her chest again. She locked the house behind her, walked down her quiet driveway, and boarded a train heading west. She had not traveled in years, not since her divorce, not since routine became her anchor, but something inside her pushed her forward now with surprising strength. As the train moved through New England, she watched the landscape blur by towns, forests, lakes, lives she would never know, and she felt the weight of time pressing against her. 30 years of silence between her and the one man she had truly loved. 30 years spent believing a lie. The farther she traveled, the more she felt the ache in her chest turning into determination. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she needed to understand it. And she needed to know if Thomas's story had ended before she could return to it. She arrived in Toronto after a long journey, stepping out into a city bustling with life, in a way that made her feel both overwhelmed and strangely hopeful. She went to public records offices, libraries, old address listings, and small bookstores, asking if anyone had heard of Thomas Reid or his pen name, which she remembered from the few essays he published back when they were together. Most people didn't recognize the name, but some pointed her toward small literary circles, old writer groups, and community events where local writers once gathered. Eleanor followed every lead, no matter how small. She rode buses across neighborhoods, walked down streets she had never heard of, and entered cafes filled with strangers who all seemed to be moving faster than her heartbeat. At night she stayed in modest inns and tiny rooms, lying awake with the letter beside her, reading it over and over until tears blurred the words. She knew she had lost decades, but she didn't want to lose the truth. On her 5th day in Canada, she arrived at a small independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and a music shop, a quiet place with wooden floors and soft lighting, the kind of shop that held stories no one else cared about. When she asked the owner, a man in his 70s with kind eyes, if he knew the name Thomas Reid, he nodded slowly, as if trying to pull a memory from deep inside his mind. He recognized the pen name immediately and said Thomas used to drop by every few months to talk about books and writing. Eleanor felt her breath catch again. This meant Thomas had lived here, not just visited. She asked when he had last seen him, and the man's expression softened with gentle sadness. He said Thomas had stopped coming a few years ago because of health issues. He didn't know the details, but the way he spoke made it clear that whatever had happened wasn't good. Eleanor felt the air around her shift, heavy and cold, but she forced herself to keep asking questions. The owner gave her the address of the last known place Thomas had lived, a small coastal area in Vancouver. Her journey continued, long and tiring, but she refused to turn back. She rode trains through the vastness of Canada, passing endless forests, mountains rising like giant shadows, and towns that looked quiet and untouched by time. The old ache inside her had turned into a steady urgency. She needed to see where he lived, needed to stand in the place where he spent the years she missed, needed to understand the shape of the life he had without her. When she finally reached Vancouver, the air smelled of salt and pine, and the ocean stretched wide and silver in the distance. Following the bookstore owner's directions, she found a neighborhood filled with modest houses and wide gardens. It was peaceful, the kind of place writers lived when they wanted quiet. The house Thomas once lived in sat at the end of a curved street, pale blue with a small porch and a wind chime that rang softly in the breeze. Her heart pounded painfully as she walked up the path. She had spent days imagining what she might find. Maybe Thomas himself, older now, gray-haired, frail but still alive, maybe surprised to see her but grateful. Maybe he would explain everything. Maybe he would tell her he still loved her. Maybe he wouldn't. She prepared herself for all versions of him except the one she actually found. When she knocked on the door, a woman in her 30s answered, holding a little boy with soft dark eyes. This was not the moment Eleanor expected. The woman looked at her with polite confusion, tilting her head slightly as if she sensed something unusual about the stranger standing nervously on her porch. Eleanor felt a surge of panic. Had she come all this way only to find strangers, people who knew nothing about Thomas? She almost walked away. But then the woman asked gently, "Are you Eleanor?" And those words hit Eleanor like a wave. She nodded slowly, stunned. The young woman's expression softened into something warm, almost emotional. "I've been waiting for the day you might come," she said quietly. She introduced herself as Lily Reid, Thomas's daughter. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her. She stepped inside the house, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it over the little boy's soft breathing. Lily explained that Thomas had talked about a woman named Eleanor Hayes many times over the years, especially near the end of his life. He said she was the great love of his past, the one he wished he could have chosen openly, the one he hoped life would bring back to him somehow. Eleanor listened in stunned silence as Lily told her that Thomas had passed away 2 years earlier. The words felt unreal, heavy, and too sharp. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the chair. She had come too late. 30 years too late. The thought cut so deeply she had to close her eyes. But Lily continued speaking with a gentle voice, explaining that Thomas had lived a complicated life after returning from Canada all those years ago. He had faced family responsibilities, illness, and difficult choices, but he never forgot Eleanor. Not for a day, Lily said. He wanted to find her again, but his health worsened before he ever found the courage. He always believed she deserved better than a broken version of him. Then Lily handed Eleanor a notebook, Thomas's journal. Eleanor touched it with trembling fingers, feeling the softness of the worn cover. She opened it slowly, reading the pages filled with his handwriting, the same loops and slants she once loved watching as he scribbled notes during long afternoons. The journal held pieces of the life he lived without her. The struggles, the small victories, the heartbreaks, the hopes he held on to. And again, she found her name written in the margins, in sentences filled with longing and regret, and a deep, quiet love that had survived decades. He had never forgotten her, never replaced her, never stopped wishing he could return to her. As Eleanor read, tears fell silently down her cheeks. She had come searching for answers, and now she had them. But the truth was both beautiful and painful. Thomas had lived loving her, and he had died with her memory still bright in his heart. When she closed the journal, the sun outside was beginning to set, casting warm light across the room. Eleanor felt both broken and awakened. She had not found Thomas alive, but she had found something else. Proof that what they shared had been real, powerful, and lasting. She felt grief, but she also felt gratitude because now she knew the truth. Now she understood the life he had lived and the love he had carried. And though she had come too late to hold him again, she had arrived just in time to recover the piece of herself she lost when she thought he abandoned her. She sat quietly in his old home, listening to the soft sounds of the wind chime outside, feeling the strange and comforting realization that even after 30 years, the story between her and Thomas was still alive. Not in the way she once imagined, but in a way that would change her forever. Eleanor sat in Thomas's old living room with the journal resting in her lap, and for a long moment she felt frozen, caught between the life she lived and the life she could have had, and the weight of both pressed against her chest like a tide that refused to settle. But even with the grief pulsing through her, there was a warmth inside her that surprised her, because reading his words made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in decades, and that feeling spread slowly like sunlight. Returning after a long storm, Lily watched her with soft understanding, holding her young son as he played with a wooden toy on the carpet, and the child's laughter created a gentle contrast to the heaviness in the room, reminding Eleanor that life never stopped moving, even when hearts were broken. Lily explained that Thomas had wanted to write to Eleanor in his later years but felt unsure, afraid that she had moved on and built a life without him, and Eleanor realized with a sudden ache that both of them had lived in separate worlds of regret, too afraid to reach across the years. She felt the sadness rising again, but this time it mixed with something stronger. A deep, steady resolve that the story would not end with regret for her. She asked Lily about Thomas's final days, what he had wanted, what he had talked about, and Lily shared that in the last weeks of his life, Thomas spoke often about unfinished dreams, roads never taken, and memories of a love that had shaped him more than anyone realized. He had told Lily that Eleanor had been the one person who understood him fully, the one person who made him believe he could live boldly, and he hoped, quietly, that she was somewhere living the life she deserved. Hearing this shook Eleanor to her core. She had spent years surviving, not really living, moving through days that felt quiet and safe but empty in a way she never wanted to admit. Now she realized Thomas had known that about her even from far away, even as decades passed, and that realization made her feel both loved and challenged. She closed the journal gently, holding it to her chest, and stood up, feeling a new kind of weight settle inside her. A weight not of sorrow but of choice. Lily offered to show Eleanor some of Thomas's things, old photographs, drafts of manuscripts, notebooks filled with half-finished ideas, and Eleanor followed her down a hallway lined with framed memories of a life she had never witnessed. She paused at a picture of Thomas holding a young Lily near a lighthouse in Vancouver, and even though the image stung her at first, she found herself smiling softly, because she could see the tenderness in his eyes, the same tenderness he once showed her. Lily placed her father's old sea-worn jacket in Eleanor's hands, saying he wore it during long walks by the water when he needed to think. Eleanor pressed it gently, imagining him moving through the cool coastal air, carrying thoughts of stories and regrets and unfinished love. She realized then that Thomas had lived a full life, even if it wasn't the life she imagined sharing with him, and that understanding softened something inside her. They returned to the living room, and Lily asked if Eleanor wanted tea. As they sat together, sipping from mismatched mugs, Eleanor felt a surprising sense of belonging, as if she were meant to be here, not because she and Thomas had been denied their story, but because this moment, meeting Lily and the child holding the journal, was part of the story too. Lily thanked her for coming, saying that her father would have been grateful, and Eleanor felt tears gather again. But this time they were gentle, not sharp. When Eleanor stepped outside later, the sun was lowering over the Pacific, turning the sky a soft gold that reflected on the waves. She stood still, breathing in the salt air, letting the ocean wind lift her hair. And in that vast quiet she felt something inside her breaking open. Not in pain but in release. She had searched for answers and she had found them, but more importantly, she had found a piece of herself she thought was gone forever. The years had carved lines on her face and slowed her steps, but her heart, her wanting, beating, yearning heart, was still alive. She realized she didn't want to go back to Portland and slip into the life she had known, the life that felt like a series of safe routines. She wanted something new, something real, something Thomas would have wanted for her. She stood at the edge of the street and watched the ocean shimmer, and an idea formed, soft at first, then steady. She would stay in Vancouver for a while, explore the coast, walk the paths he walked, visit the places he loved, not to cling to him, but to honor the part of her that still needed wonder. She returned to her small rented room that night and spent hours reading the rest of the journal. Some entries were painful, heavy with the struggles he faced, but many were hopeful, filled with dreams he never abandoned. In his final entry, written with unsteady handwriting, Thomas had written a message directly to her, saying that if she ever read these words, he hoped she would live boldly, love bravely, and never again shrink her world to fit the expectations of others. He urged her not to wait for perfect moments, but to create them. And at the end he wrote, "If life is giving you time, Eleanor, use it well. Live for real." Those words echoed in her as she closed the journal and looked around the quiet room. She realized she had been drifting for years, surviving rather than living, holding her heart in a small safe box much like the cedar one that hid his letter. Now she felt the lid lifting. She felt herself expanding into the space life was offering. The next morning she woke early and walked to the beach. The air was cool and fresh, the waves steady and calm, and as she stepped onto the sand, she felt a freedom she hadn't felt in decades. She watched families walking dogs, couples holding hands, older people sitting on benches, watching the sunrise, and she felt herself becoming part of this world instead of merely observing it. She walked for hours, letting the ocean settle her heart. Each step felt like a promise, to Thomas, to the woman she used to be, and to the woman she still wanted to become. She visited a cafe by the water, tried new foods, talked to strangers, and allowed herself to be curious again. She found a small art shop and bought a sketchbook, something she hadn't owned since she was 20. She filled the first page with a simple drawing of the waves, then wrote one sentence beneath it. "This is the beginning." Days passed, then weeks, and Eleanor felt herself slowly growing lighter. She shared stories with Lily, spent time with her son, and discovered strength she didn't know she had. She visited parks, museums, small towns along the coast. She let herself laugh more, speak more, breathe more. The grief didn't disappear. It lived quietly inside her, but it no longer held her down. Instead, it reminded her of the depth of her heart, the love she had been capable of, the love she still could hold. She thought often of Thomas, but not with regret. Instead, she felt gratitude, because he had loved her deeply, and because his letter, lost for 30 years, had found her exactly when she needed it. It had pulled her out of a life half-lived and into a future that still held beauty. One evening, standing on a cliff overlooking the sea, she whispered a soft thank you to the wind. Not goodbye. Just thank you. because their story, though unfinished, had pushed her into a new beginning. By the end of her first month in Vancouver, Eleanor knew something with absolute certainty. She was no longer the woman who waited for life to pass. She was choosing life now, choosing movement, choosing possibility. She had started living for real. And for the first time in decades, the future, however long or short, felt wide open and bright.